Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this build video I'll be covering my conversion of a 1/72nd scale Grumman S-2G tracker which I did for the Queensland Air Museum's new HMAS Melbourne aircraft carrier display. This is one I actually started about 2 years ago and was a build that really pushed me outside of my comfort zone as I was dealing with resin conversion parts, attempting to do folding wings, rescoring panel lines, and it was also in the early days of me using an airbrush and 3D printing, so a lot of skills that I was still developing at the time. I will talk a bit about what I would do differently, and friendly advice is of course welcome, but not every model has to be perfect to be worthwhile, and at the end of the day, myself and the team were really happy with the results I achieved. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into building this one. For this project, I'd been provided with the Hasegawa 1/72nd scale S2A tracker kit, and a required Hawkeye conversion set to make it the noticeably different S2E or G tracker used by the Royal Australian Navy. Off camera, all of the parts were given a wash in some warm soapy water, and then I immediately set about removing the kit's wingtips with some side cutters, running my scribing tool along the wing's folding seams to cut them off for my wing folding mechanism plan, and to cut the nose section from the fuselage in order to add the extension plug. After that, I started working on the cockpit, which I'd designed some new 3D printed parts to add a bit of extra detail for. I had to remove the centre pedestal from the cockpit floor, and unfortunately it broke because the plastic in this kit seems to be rather brittle. Once it was repaired, I then glued the centre pedestal I'd designed into place using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, which I like to use for both resin parts and also clear plastic ones since they don't fog things up. The doorway was then cut out of the cockpit's plastic bulkheads, and the alignment parts for the kit's main panel removed before the cockpit canopy halves were glued together and my overhead panel added into place, once again with the odorless CA glue. The cockpit was then painted several layers of Vallejo Model Air Light Gull Grey since it seemed to be a reasonably close match based on my reference photos, although perhaps a slightly bluer grey might have been more accurate, and I believe the canopy framework should have actually been painted black. Flat black was however used for the main instrument panel, overhead panel, and the centre pedestal, applied in several layers with a brush. When I started this kit, I didn't yet have an airbrush, although fortunately I would have one by the time I was working on the exterior. The canopy was painted with the light gull grey from the outside, and since this would also be the aircraft's exterior colour, I then neatened up any mistakes I made with a cocktail stick by gently scratching the excess paint away, and the canopy's exterior was done. The main instrument panel was then dry brushed with some Vallejo flat white to highlight some of the raised switches and details, including the gauges, and it was also used to pick out the main radar screen, several switches on the overhead panel, and to dry brush the centre pedestal. Vermilion red and flat yellow were also used for various interior details, including to paint the yellow escape hatch trim in the cockpit. The red and yellow were also mixed together in an even ratio to make orange for the seats and also the plot screen on the main instrument panel. Once all of these details were painted, I then ran some Tamiya black panel wash over the details. This enamel based wash flows into the recesses of any surface, helping to make the details stand out. The last thing I did in the cockpit was dab a bit of gloss varnish onto all of the instrument gauges and the plot screen to give them a behind glass effect. The instrument panel would then be glued into the cockpit once it had been slightly trimmed to ensure it would fit. The cockpit halves were then glued together, sealing things up, though I left the canopy unglued. The conversion kit included a different radome, so this was added before I joined the fuselage halves together, and they fitted together quite nicely, with a bit of tape and bulldog clip being used to hold the parts together tightly while they bonded. My plan for this kit was to attempt to make folding wings so that the aircraft could flexibly be displayed with the wings in either position. Though it would somewhat work, it was a bit of a compromise on detail, and ultimately my tracker would have its wings fixed in the folded position when it was put on the flight deck. For this modification, I tried using some remote control aircraft hinges, which were positioned and the outline drawn with a pen, so that I could then cut away the plastic and fit them to the wings. Once again, the brittleness of the plastic certainly didn't help, but eventually I had a hinge area cut out. I then glued the cut out pieces of plastic to the inside of the wings, planning to use them as a base piece for the hinges to attach to, and then I left them to dry. Australian trackers had an extra set of ejection chutes for sonar buoys, so I removed the kit's original shroud and glued a resin piece included in the Hawkeye kit to the back of the engine nacelles. The main landing gear legs come as a single piece which was glued to the inside of the nacelles, and then the halves were joined. I tried several types of glue for the hinges, but found that the Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue seemed to work best, and while letting them dry, I glued the main wheels to the legs, and then installed the engine into the front cowling piece, followed by the propeller, which gets slotted into the engine and locked into place with a washer so that it will still rotate. In hindsight, I probably could have made life easier by not adding the propeller until last and using glue rather than the kit's intended washer system, since it obviously wouldn't need to for the display. Once the RC hinges were in place, I coated them in some Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty so that I could cover over their texture. Ordinarily, I would use a Vallejo water-based putty, but I had some extra tubes of the plastic putty to use up, and it doesn't seem to shrink quite as much on larger areas such as these. A cocktail stick was used to smooth over the putty while it dried, and I made sure that the wings could still fold before leaving them aside to let the putty fully cure. The nose wheel strut was then glued into the nose wheel bay, which, much like the main wheel wells, doesn't have any detail, and then I glued the nose wheel to the strut, though this would have been better to do a bit later on. I installed the lower fuselage part, which includes the tail hook, and then added the tail wheel to it, which stops the aircraft from scraping its tail on takeoff and landing. A different magnetic anomaly detector boom is included in the Hawkeye conversion set, so I removed the kit's original one and installed only the wider end of the boom since it was going to be retracted onto the back of the tail. Resin horizontal stabilizers are included since the E and G model tracker had a larger set, so these were cleaned up with a knife and then glued to the tail. The resin fuselage extension plug from the conversion kit was glued to the fuselage, followed by the engine nacelles to the wings, which I had dry fitted. I added some nose weight in the form of blue tack and some fish sinkers before then gluing the severed cockpit area to the front of the fuselage plug. There were some pretty big gaps, which I initially attempted to fill with the perfect plastic putty. I also noticed that the kit's nose wheel was not compressed, meaning that it was too tall to allow the aircraft to even sit on its main wheels, instead sort of rocking awkwardly from the nose wheel and the tail wheel. So to fix this, I cut off the shock absorber, trimmed it down, and then glued it back on, though as mentioned, it would have been much easier to have left it off until last since it was very delicate. I'd been pretty messy with my application of the plastic putty, and it would require some sanding to make it smooth, but after the first coat the gaps were still present, and I also noticed that there were a lot of divots and rough textures within the plastic putty. It also occurred to me at this stage that the raised panel details would be lost, so after filling some of the finer gaps with Vallejo water-based putty, I decided to disassemble the aircraft slightly and go about using my scribing tool to attempt and rescribe the raised lines. In some spots the raised lines were very weak, so I used a knife to try and more carefully add marks for the scribing tool to follow. This was amongst my earliest attempts at panel line scribing, and long before I had any SMS scribing tape, so the results were not very good. Although better than losing any surface detail and maybe slightly better than raised ones, I would need to do a lot of cleanup from the mistakes I'd made due to my poor techniques. I also should have made the decision sooner, as it was a lot harder to scribe onto parts of the aircraft that had been assembled, and as a result I even left the engine nacelles with raised panel lines, as I wasn't confident trying to scribe them on difficult to reach rounded surfaces, and I wouldn't have to sand too much on them in terms of gaps and filling. Although I didn't have any tape to use as a scribing guide, I did have a template for some of the round access hatches, which I was still getting the hang of and probably need to get a better fine scribing tool than my awkward and bulky AK1 I currently have. After the panel line scribing was done, I then reassembled the model, adding the extended wingtips from the Hawkeye conversion and some inside wing detail parts which I designed and 3D printed. The engine cowling and base piece for the searchlight were added along with the landing gear bay doors, and as you may notice, the fragile nose wheel had to be repaired for the first of many times. The right horizontal stabilizers had a chunk missing, possibly from me not doing a good job carefully cleaning them up, but fortunately this was a reasonably easy fix. I trimmed out a piece of 1mm thick styrene and glued it into place to replace the missing chunk, and then added the smoke marker units from the conversion kit. To clean up the scribed panel lines, I first ran some Tamiya extra thin along all of them to soften them up slightly, and once that had been done, I then began fixing imperfections by filling them over with some Vallejo water-based putty. To help me find and clean up additional imperfections, I decided to try spraying the model in some Vallejo acrylic white primer before sanding. This was done in several light coats, although I didn't bother making it uniform like I would have if I was using it as a base for paints, since the purpose of the white was to highlight surfaces on the aircraft to help expose gaps, seams, or any dodgy panel lines that I hadn't fixed. The primer was given a few hours to fully cure, and then I started using various grades of sandpaper to sand away the fuselage seam lines, try and smooth over the putty texture, especially on the fuselage and wings, and also sand over the putty I'd used to fill the gaps so that it was flush with the plastic surface around it. The primer certainly helped me find imperfections, though I was rough and several parts including one wing and even the cockpit would come off and have to be re-glued. Many larger gaps and rough textures persisted, so I repeated the process of filling them up with putty, letting the putty cure, and then sanding these areas smooth with gradually finer grades of sandpaper. Gradually the model started looking better, but I was still not happy at all with the fuselage plug and the uneven rough texture from the putty on the wings. For these stubborn areas, I decided to try a new tactic. I tested out applying some Mr. Surface 1000 using a brush over these areas, and thinned slightly with some Mr. Colour leveling thinner. After giving it 24 hours to cure, I would once again sand these areas, and this time the results were much smoother. Since doing this model, I've heard that some more professional model makers will actually spray the entire model with Mr. Surfacer using an airbrush to fill smaller gaps and then do sanding, but I hadn't really heard of the tactic when I was working on the model at the time, and even if I had, I probably wouldn't have risked my brand new airbrush and also this model on trying this technique. With what I believed was the last round of filling and sanding done, I decided to add the last of the finer details such as my own 3D printed fuel dump tube, radar bulge, and various antennas. The kit's absent nose light was drilled out and the dodgy landing gear and its doors reattached, before I then primed the aircraft again, this time though with some Vallejo gloss black primer. I gradually built the primer up in several thin passes so that it just became wet and continued to add the layers until the upper side was a uniform gloss black. I made sure to lift up the wings and prime the inside wing details, and after doing the upper surface, I let it dry for an hour or so, before then mounting the aircraft on some old Tamiya paint jars and priming the underside as well. After 24 hours, the primer had cured, so I masked off the sections of the wings, stabilizer and engine cowlings that would be black, and then I mounted the aircraft back onto the Tamiya paint jars and began to spray the underside with Vallejo Model Air Insignia White, mixed to an even ratio of 1 part Vallejo acrylic flow improver to 1 part paint. I gradually built the paint up in several thin passes, filling in the panels first and then doing wider passes for some very subtle pre-shading. Once the underside was then a reasonably solid colour, I placed the model on its wheels and sprayed some white onto the ailerons, flaps and elevators, which often had a white trim on Royal Australian Navy trackers. I let the insignia white dry and cure for about 12 hours, before then carefully masking off the white on the upper surface. Initially, I didn't mask off the white on the underside of the fuselage and wings, since I wanted a soft transition between the grey and white in this area. Vallejo Model Air Light Gull Grey was applied initially with the same mixture of paint to flow improve it as I'd done with the insignia white, though I found I had a lot of stoppages. I cleaned out my airbrush cup and tried a new mix with 9 drops of flow improver, a drop of Vallejo acrylic retardener to try and combat any tip drying, and 9 drops of the light gull grey. I still had the paint flow struggle a bit, so I suspect there might have been some paint clogging up the nozzle of the airbrush. Since this is one of my earliest airbrush builds, I still hadn't gotten into the habit of properly cleaning my airbrush out after sessions, but the retardener still seemed to make up a little bit for this. I probably could have also masked the black of the nose area off, but since it was a rather curved shape, I decided to just paint it later on by hand. Eventually, after several layers, the light gull grey was pretty solidly built up, though I still wasn't happy with the panel lines and the surface finish of the model. The panel lines were still too prominent and some small imperfections were noticeable, so I ended up getting out the Vallejo putty once again and applied it all over the panel lines and imperfections. I then used a damp finger to remove the excess putty, leaving it only in the gaps, and since it would shrink slightly, the panel lines would become a lot more subtle but not lost entirely. After a few hours, the putty was dry, so I did some light sanding with 1500 grit sandpaper to remove any raised bits of remaining putty and also further soften some of the seam lines. I then wiped away the dust from the sanding with a microfiber cloth, masked off the black, and resprayed the underside and control surfaces once again with Insignia White. Having the folding wing options actually made painting a tiny bit easier, as I could quite easily fold the wings up to paint the inside details, and then move them back to the extended position and still paint the whole wing as one, keeping the finish nice and consistent. Before spraying the light gull grey again, I decided this time to mask off the Insignia White on the underside, as I wasn't happy earlier with the original soft blended effect. Again, being an early airbrush job, I hadn't yet tried AK masking putty, which I would have probably used for the wavy fuselage countershade pattern if I was doing this model again, but for this build I decided to just mask the area off in general, and once the grey had been applied, I used a brush to then apply several thin coats of Insignia White and light gold grey to hand paint the wavy pattern, and try to give it a slightly softer edge by overlapping some of the layers. I did some touch-ups on the control surfaces and then used Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black to paint the tyres, previously mentioned nose trim, the black trims on the underside radomes, and also to neaten up both the engine cowlings and leading edges of the wing. I had some reference photos of restored Royal Australian Navy trackers from when I visited the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society, which were very helpful in spotting finer details to correct, such as the extra curved black strips on the very tips of the wings that the marking guides didn't show. The propellers were hand painted first with light gull grey and then followed by white for the tips, RLM01 silver for the spinners, and vermilion red for the stripes. Annoyingly, one of the trucker's blades joined the fragile nose wheel and its habit of falling off if bumped even a tiny bit, and despite several attempts to glue them back into place, it would only last until the parts were even slightly provoked. I tried initially with Revell Contactor Professional, but when that didn't work, I then used super glue, and in the nose wheel's case, a tiny bit of putty as well to reinforce the joint. Once the painting was completed, I went ahead and sprayed the model in several passes of Vallejo gloss varnish to seal and protect the paint job, and also give the model a smooth glossy surface to prevent the decals from silvering when they were applied. The varnish would be given 24 hours to fully cure, before I would then apply the first of the decals. The Hawkeye conversion set includes decals for several different E or G model trackers, and I decided to choose 844 since this is one of the HMAS trackers I got to crawl through, and since it was also of course used on the HMAS Melbourne. The aftermarket white base decals have to be applied for the larger decals first, before the coloured ones could then be applied, presumably because unlike with commercial kit decals made with expensive industrial printing equipment, doing aftermarket decals with white ink is a real pain, and often the ink is slightly transparent with the coloured ones, so the white backing decals are required to make the marking solid and uniform, especially over a complex or dark camo colour. The decals were quite frustrating to deal with as they were very flimsy and folded up easily, much to my annoyance, and the walkway markings in particular caused a lot of swearing when they tore up and folded badly, even when I was being very gentle. I attempted to then add the kit's original decals to fix the walkway markings, but they must have been quite old or sawed pretty badly as they pretty much disintegrated. Once all of the white and black decals were applied, I then sealed them in with some Tamiya decal adhesive and let them dry for a few hours. Some further swearing and a lot of fiddling about later, and I had mostly intact walkway markings on the upper surface of the wings, though fortunately these would be partially hidden when the wings were folded. The process was then repeated with the coloured decals, and after a few small paint touch-ups to correct some of the mistakes I'd noticed while doing them, I then sealed all of the decals in with some Vallejo semi-gloss varnish, which would not only protect everything, but also give the aircraft a slightly glossy finish, which was often the case on well-kept Royal Australian Navy aircraft. And speaking of well-kept, it was decided by the team that our HMAS Melbourne and its aircraft should be done with minimal weathering, so I was specifically told to not over-weather my model. I don't know why I was singled out, but anyways, looking at reference photos, the Royal Australian Navy trackers were generally pretty clean, but they had radial engines, and as I like to say, if a radial is not leaking oil, there's probably nothing in it. So I got out some of Tylong engine grime and black oil paints, squeezed a blob out onto some cardboard, and left the blobs for a few hours to allow the excess oil to leak out of them. In the meantime, the engines and wheels received a coat of Tamiya black enamel panel wash to highlight the details, as well as to add a slight bit of oil and grime. Any excess enamel wash was then removed with some X20 enamel thinners and a cotton bud, though unlike on my other builds, I wouldn't apply any panel wash on other parts of the aircraft to keep it looking quite spotless. I still had some time before the oil paints were ready, so I went ahead and attached the searchlight base piece and painted it along with the nose light I drilled out earlier with some RLM01 silver. Trackers also had a mirror on their engine nacelle, which I painted using this colour. I'm not sure if this was on both sides of most trackers, but the Haas ones only seem to have this mirror on the left side, and I believe it's so that the pilot can double check that his nose wheel is retracted. For the small fuselage windows, I decided to use some micro crystal clear applied over the top of them rather than the kit's included plastic ones, and once that had been applied, the oil paints were finally ready to be used. I reactivated the dried up parts of the paint with some odourless thinners, and then used a very fine brush to apply both colours in a dabbing motion on the cowlings, on some of the wing's access hatches, and in a streaking motion from the back of the exhausts. I then softly blended and streaked them in with a brush dipped in odourless thinners, keeping the effect subtle and basing it off of reference photos. With some subtle weathering completed, next came perhaps the most painful part of this build, the rigging. I had to look at quite a few different pictures before I somewhat understood the absolute maze that is a Royal Australian Navy's tracker wiring setup. Several lines linked to different small antennas, which I had to 3D print as none are included in the kit conversion, and unfortunately the wires put a lot of tension on these parts, and so not only did I have to add the rigging wire, but I also had to repair these tiny antennas a few times, and one of them did break after I'd finished the model, though fortunately it was quite subtle, so I ended up just leaving it. I was definitely not the only one who had a painful time rigging their trackers for this project, so if you're thinking of doing a tracker, beware the pain of this experience. Once I was done with the rigging, the last step would end up being fixing the wings in place, since by this stage it was decided that my tracker would be permanently displayed with the wings folded. So after a bit of superglue and a surprisingly large amount of pressure and time to convince the wings to stop being posable, my contribution to the HMAS Melbourne for the Queensland Air Museum in the form of this Grumman Tracker was finally completed. And here you can see the finished tracker both on its own and also aboard the carrier. If you're ever near Caloundra, I highly recommend visiting the Queensland Air Museum and seeing this ship in person, as the photos really don't do it justice. I wish I could say that this ended up being one of my most smooth and enjoyable builds, but that would be a bit of a lie. This was my first proper conversion using aftermarket resin parts, and to more experienced modelers, I'm sure that's painfully obvious in places. The panel lines are also, well, not great. A lack of practice, no proper scribing tape, and the brilliant decision to attempt major rescribing work after assembly made things far harder than they needed to be. My attempts to fix and fill everything weren't exactly flawless either, though they did at least recover the model from being a lot worse. The folding wings were another good idea at the time sort of project, and they do sacrifice a bit of accuracy and ultimately weren't especially necessary for this display, but I still want to keep experimenting with folding wings on model kits in the future for both my stop motions and also display flexibility. Despite all of that, I'm glad I pushed through instead of settling for a rough finish like I probably would have done on some of my earlier builds. I've definitely learnt the value of spending a lot of time sanding, filling, repainting, then sanding and filling again until you finally have something presentable. The resin cockpit and wing folding section added some really nice subtle detail, the paintwork turned out pretty clean and nice, I'm happy with the restrained weathering, and while the rigging isn't perfect, it still looks respectable enough from normal viewing distance. This build was a massive learning curve, and while I can still see every flaw in this kit, everyone on the Melbourne team was incredibly happy with the results, and in the end it looks pretty great as part of a much larger project. Doing this tracker has pretty much put me off converting another tracker for quite some time, even though it is my favourite Royal Australian Navy aircraft. It also led me to politely decline doing one of the Sea King builds for this project, which would have required more conversion work using the Airfix kit. Instead though, I ended up contributing further by designing and 3D printing the flight deck's vehicles, and painting a large number of the deck crew figures. If you guys are interested, I might also cover some of that work in a future video. Ultimately, I do wish this tracker had been started a few months later so it could have benefited from the lessons I've learnt since then, but even with its flaws, I'm still pretty happy with it, and more importantly, I'm proud to have played a small part in the HMAS Melbourne project, and I'm glad that it's out there helping inspire people and teach them a bit about Australian naval aviation history through the art of model making. Thank you so much for watching this build video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and also consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss any future videos. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund the products I used to make this kit, And also a big shout out to the Queensland Air Museum. Again, I highly recommend you pay them a visit if you happen to be in the Sunshine Coast area, and there's a good chance you'll see some more videos in the not too distant future covering some of the other little projects and modelling things I've worked on there. Be sure to let me know if you want to see a video in the future covering me painting the figures as well as doing the deck vehicles, including the aircraft tugs, forklifts, the Beast crane and the Massey Ferguson tractors. That's it for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.